Shabbat Shalom. As we all know, Monopoly is the beloved game that everybody hates. But more importantly, it is a game that everybody knows the rules of, right? So if I ask you, what happens if you land on free parking? You tell me. Nothing. Nothing. The rules actually say that if you land on free parking, nothing happens. You never put money in free parking. You never put the money from all the fines and other things there to be collected, to be picked up by whoever happens to land on it as a jackpot. That is a house rule that is very, very widespread, but it is a house rule. And in many ways, it ruins the game. Because what is the objective in Monopoly? To get all the money. And how do you get all the money in Monopoly? Building houses, which cause what to happen when someone lands on them? They give you more money. Well, the whole point of Monopoly is to make sure that no one has any money except you. And if there is a pot of money floating around in the middle of the board, just waiting for someone lucky enough to land on it, then all of your hard effort to bankrupt them goes out the window. Because now they're back in the game. You had them this close, and then they get all that extra money, and now they can still go for more rounds. It is very frustrating. Likewise, there were other rules in Monopoly that most people ignore. For example, the first time somebody lands on a property and they choose not to buy it, most people just say, okay, it goes to the next person's turn. That is not the rules. The rules are, if no one wants to buy the property the first time it's been landed on, you auction it off. It immediately goes into an open auction, and whoever wants to bid on it can bid on it from around the board. Again, this is meant to accelerate the property acquisition, in particular by people who have enough money to outbid their competitors, which allow them to gain more monopolies faster, thus shortening the game because they can grind their opponents into the dust in short order. If you think that Monopoly takes too long and you're playing with free parking and you're not auctioning off the properties, that's why it takes too long. You're being too kind. You're being too gentle. Now, to understand this, we're going to have to do a little bit more game theory. I know that's been a theme over a couple of recent sermons, and we're going to do a little more. Very simple topic, however, because we have to understand what kind of game Monopoly is. It is what is called a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game. You've probably heard people talk about zero-sum. That means that somebody wins and somebody loses. But it's a little more technical than that. We don't need to go into all the details, but the gist of it is that my winning is because of your loss. That is to say, I get money because you gave it to me, which means I now have more and you now have less. And ideally, in a perfect zero-sum game, it would be exactly equal. You go down $200, I go up $200. I'm winning, you're losing. You can see that the total of up and down is zero. Hence the term zero-sum game. Monopoly is designed to mostly be a zero-sum game, where there's a little bit of money pumped into it by going around Go and the occasional beauty contest prize. But most of the money is already on the board when you start by what you got from the bank, and it's just about shuffling that money around until it ends up in one person's hands and no one else's. A classic zero-sum game. Poker is another zero-sum game. All the money that you win came out of the pockets of the other people around the table. You only won what they lost. A perfect zero-sum game. But those are not the only kind of games that exist. There are also, well, you can probably guess, if there is a zero-sum game, there is probably also a positive-sum game and a negative-sum game. The negative sum is probably a little bit hard to wrap your mind around. How can I win if we're both worse off at the end of the game? Well, quite frankly, have you ever watched a boxing match? Right? We've all seen the movie Rocky. Who won at the end of Rocky? Not Rocky. That's another one of those misnomers. Apollo Creed won at the end of Rocky, but you're forgiven for not knowing that, because as they stood there bleeding next to each other, it was not easy to tell who had won. It was won on, a technical knockout. So They both suffered immensely in that movie, and yet one of them is still decreed the winner because, well, they were still standing slightly better than the person next to them. Zero-sum games aren't fun, but they are sometimes more attractive than they ought to be. There are many cases where people don't care about getting ahead, but they do care about having a relative position to somebody that matters to them. And as long as their relative position is higher than the other, they don't mind if they actually went down. This is the bitterness, this is pettiness, this can be vengeance, this can be family dinners, where as long as I got a little bit extra, even though Mom is angry at both of us, as long as I ended up being slightly less punished than you, I'm happy because you got it worse. That is a negative-sum game. Hopefully, most of us don't have those too often in our personal lives, but we probably all experienced it at some point. And our third version of a game would be a positive-sum game. A positive-sum game is where there's still a winner. There's still somebody at the table that ends up going away with more than anyone else, but how they gained it was not necessarily at the expense of the other people around that table. There are many sort of economic simulations, many country building simulations out there. These are a little bit more complicated than playing backgammon, but these games don't rely upon crushing the opponent. They rely upon maximizing what you've got to a higher degree than what the other people have, and your win does not come at their expense, even though at the end of the game you have more points and you get declared the winner. Positive-sum games in the real world, outside of the board game market, are actually meant to be everywhere. You see, business, which many people treat as a negative-sum game, or at the very least a zero-sum game, was actually intended, at least according to the patron saint of Adam Smith of capitalism, to be a positive-sum game. The classic description of the game of business would be you have somebody who makes apples and somebody who makes wool. And both of them do a really good job of making each of those products, and they don't do a good job of making the other person's product. So what do? Well, the guy who makes apples sells them to the guy who makes wool, and the guy who makes wool sells it to the guy who makes apples, and in that free exchange, both of them come out better than if they were each trying to make wool and apples at the same time for themselves, because it would be less efficient, less productive, and it would cost them more. So in the end, they both gain from a good exchange when it is agreeable to both parties. And, says Adam Smith, this is how you generate wealth for the entire nation, because you help this engine of the economy continue to go for the benefit of all, and it generates more than the individual people put in, which means it lifts everyone up altogether, in theory. The problem is that as much as these negative, positive, and zero-sum games are easily understood when we're talking about game night around your dining room table, in the real world, there is often a fight over which game we're actually playing. That is to say, there are many people, many organizations, many nations that wish to dictate the type of game that is being played. For some, it is because they don't believe they can win in a positive-sum game, and winning is more important. They may not end up on top, and that means they will be angrier than if they could end up higher, but lower than they would have been had they actually been playing a positive-sum game. Did everybody follow that logic? Right? It's actually more natural than you can imagine. Right? Somebody comes along to your neighborhood and says, we've got a great project that we're going to come in and we're going to give everybody free solar panels. And it's going to be great. And you look around and all your other neighbors have much sunnier roofs. And all your other neighbors have much bigger roofs. And you go to your HOA and you vote it down. Why? Because you would benefit less than all of your neighbors, and now their houses are going to be worth more. They're going to be making more money off that energy every month than you are, and you can't stand the thought of them getting ahead further than you. So you scupper the deal in order to make sure they can't, even though that means you're worse off than you would have been with whatever your roof could have had for those solar panels. But hey, at least you still have your status. At least you still have your standing. And at least everyone in the neighborhood hates you. But this is a very real type of mentality, and not only in HOAs and neighborhoods, but on the international stage as well. We talked about this when we talked about the deal that Israel has been making with Hamas with regards to the ceasefire, that the win conditions, the idea of what Hamas wants to get from this conflict is radically different than what Israel wants to get from this conflict, and it creates a very unequal bargaining position. So how do we work on this? Well, funny enough, although the Torah never uses the term positive sum game, this week's Torah portion is entirely constructed to create a rule set that is a positive sum game for the community. It tries to establish Mishpatim, tries to establish rules and laws that when you play the game of living together in a society, everybody ends off better. And it doesn't matter who's coming out on top and who's coming out on the bottom, because we all benefit from adherence to Torah. And it's not just the ideas of kashrut and Shabbos, which everybody thinks is so central to Judaism, and they are, but it is the other elements of Torah that are so central to society, which may not be as commonly implemented in the modern world because we lack our own judicial system to be able to force compliance with these particular rules. But that doesn't mean as an individual Jew we cannot look to them as guidance and even as commandments for ourselves. Take, for example, the most famous section, lost property. You see your neighbor's goat and he is gone and across the hills, and you happen to stumble across him on your walk to the market. What are you commanded to do under Jewish law? What's that? Return the goat. Why? That takes your effort. That takes your time. You're going to be late for the market. You may not get the best stall place. Someone might buy from another seller rather than you. You are losing money by returning his stupid goat, which you've told him he needed to take better care of. Why should I bother doing this? Because it's the decent thing to do, it's the compassionate thing to do, absolutely right, totally unconvincing to a person who's only worried about themselves. And the great thing about the Torah is, while it tells us to be decent and compassionate and kind people, it also knows that for many people, telling them that won't get the results you want. You have to actually create another incentive in order to persuade them that there is a better way to play this game. And this is an example of one of those incentives. If I return my neighbor's goat, what do I get from it? Reciprocation. Exactly right. Spoken like an academic, right? Reciprocation. When I return my goat, he may or may not be in a position to return a goat to me, but I continue to reinforce the idea that in this community, we are the kind of people who return goats. We are the kind of people who take care of each other's lost property, so that when my wallet goes missing, when my goat goes missing, when anything goes missing, I don't immediately think, well, that's it, gone now, someone's taken it, it's stolen. Instead, I can reliably expect that it will make its way back to me, because someone from my community will have found it, and it will end up back in my hands eventually. But that only happens if I play the game by the same set of rules. If I return the goat, then I will find eventually that I will be more confident that my things will return too. If I choose to opt out, then that community rule set quickly falls apart. Because if I don't return the goat, then the next person won't return something to someone else, and then that person won't return something, and then eventually I'm going to want them to be returning, and it's not going to happen. Now, how is this a positive sum game rather than just we all get to keep our stuff? Well, because there are costs incurred when we have to be paranoid about protecting our property. How much is spent when we have to waste our efforts locking all the windows, barring all the gates, setting all the alarms, paying for all the surveillance? If we didn't have to pay for that, all of that money would be allowed to go to something else, more productive, more fulfilling, more satisfying, and not just trying to keep what we have, because we actually can now trust that what we have will stay with us, and even if it gets lost, eventually return to us. That is a net gain for me. And all I had to do was return a goat. All I had to do was return that goat. Even if I wasn't a kind person, even if I wasn't a decent person, I should be able to see that it is in my interest to live in a community where goats get returned. And likewise, when the Torah gives us rules about the potential property hazards around us, of opening up pits, of having places where an animal or a person might hurt themselves, and the responsibility, the liability for the people to make sure that doesn't happen. When we have the rules about what to do with dangerous animals and what responsibilities you incur. This is not just about bringing down the hammer of justice in order to punish those that have done something wrong or negligent. This is about ideally structuring society around these positive sum game ideas so that all of us benefit by just doing the kind of decent thing. It creates this cumulative benefit for all of us. Now, the most radical thing that the Torah does is tell us that we can do this, that we can change the game, that we don't have to be stuck in a zero-sum game, and God forbid in a negative-sum game. That life does not have to be a boxing match. Life doesn't even have to be a game of Monopoly. That life can actually have positive sum outcomes for all of the participants within that community and even a more expansive circle of participants. All you have to do is change the rules. God did that through revelation. We, in the United States, believe we can continue to do that through legislation. That's the changing of the rules by the decree of the people's representatives, that we are allowed to change the rules. But we have to keep our eye on what we are changing them for, what we are changing them to achieve. If we're changing them to create a positive sum outcome, then we are in line with exactly what God has asked. If we change them to create a zero-sum outcome where we could have a positive one, then we are already robbing each other of the potential gains that we could have. And God help us if, like the people mentioned in the Haftorah, we create a negative-sum game where we not only hurt others, but we hurt ourselves in the process so that we are worse off by implementing these ideas. The Torah tells us we can change this system. Now, I want you to imagine exactly how radical this can be. Everybody here, at least if you're normal, you probably don't enjoy Monopoly too much. You either think it's too competitive or you think that it takes too long, but there are ways to change the game of Monopoly. Rather than making the objective bankrupting everybody else at the table, make the objective to empty the bank. Make the objective to empty the bank. If the bank runs out of money, you all lose at the table. Sorry, if the bank runs out of money, you all win at the table. Okay? How would you achieve that? How would you change the way you play the game to achieve that situation? How do you get money out of the bank? Pass go. So what do you have to make sure is going to happen? Everybody is kept. Nobody falls out of the game because everybody who falls out is one fewer person draining that bank. That means when they land on your boardwalk with the big fat hotel, well, maybe you don't charge them the full rate. Maybe you give them a break. Or maybe you don't build the hotel in the first place. Maybe if you see somebody beginning to flag, you sell them some property that allows them to get a start back in the game, to have a place where they can feel more secure, where maybe they can participate in the economy and the money can keep going around the board more evenly rather than being monopolized by only a few of the other players.
So what do we call the game now?
Well, you can call the game still Monopoly, but ultimately there is one monopoly in the game of Monopoly at the very beginning. It's the bank. The bank has all the money, and the bank gives you all the money to start with, and that's what you're playing with. So you're trying to break the ultimate monopoly in this particular game. Now, this is not meant to argue that we have to have particular policies in the rational world around us. But if you can see that you could change a game from a zero sum into positive sum simply by changing the goal that you have decided for yourselves you're going to play, and by not violating any of the rules of Monopoly, because you are absolutely allowed not to build houses, and you are absolutely allowed to give money to other players, and you're absolutely allowed to sell property at whatever price you see is fit, that you are able to create a better experience. You're not going to be trying to harm each other, but instead trying to overcome a mutual difficulty. This is the call of Torah, not just for changing the game of Monopoly. It's certainly fine to play zero-sum games when you're in the privacy of your home, but by changing the rules of society, that we do not have to live in a cutthroat, dog-eat-dog society of some idealized and dystopian version of living in the state of nature, where we are all red of tooth and claw slashing at each other, but instead to find a way where we all can benefit from the blessings that God has given to all of us. It's really not that hard once you open your mind to the possibility that the rules that we thought were obvious, the rules we thought were automatic, and the rules we thought were non-negotiable, those are ours all along. You want to load up free parking? Go for it. But even better, change the rules. Shabbat Shalom.